Welcome back. Now we're heading into part two of logical fallacies. So very similar to the first part, we're going to cover three more categories, and then we'll practice some of the specific fallacies in at least the first two categories. So the three categories of logical fallacies we're going to cover in the second part are argumentation, induction, and procedural fallacies. So argumentation fallacies have to do with mistakes in the strategy behind the logical arguments that we make. Induction fallacies have to do with generalizing specific pieces of evidence in making our argument. And procedural fallacies more refer to a failure to follow logical or debate protocol. So we're not going to practice examples of this because these are more kind of like FYI. You need to follow these procedures rather than identifying examples of them. So our first category is fallacies of argumentation. And the first example of an argumentation fallacy is non sequitur, which is Latin for it does not follow. This is where the conclusion that we make doesn't logically follow from the basis of our arguments. So we kind of word vomit and then make a conclusion based off that word vomit and then try to say, well, obviously I proved it to be right, when the premises of your argument have nothing to do with the conclusion that you try to make. You kind of go over the place and then make a conclusion, and none of it makes sense. This is really close. It's a very common mistake, especially made in papers, where we just share a lot of information and then don't show how it actually connects to the final conclusion we're trying to make. Partly because a good argument is about making connections. So Socratic logic would say something like, if A equals B and B equals C, then A must equal C. So if A equals B, if A is the same as B, and B equals C, B is the same as C, well, then B is the middle connector, then A must equal C. That would be an example of a basic Socratic logic. So we have to do the same thing in our logic. We have to kind of make the connection from point to point logically to reach a conclusion. If we don't do that and we kind of just put unconnected information together and then try to make a conclusion based off that, or information that has nothing to do with each other, then it's a non sequitur. So if we say, well, the grass is green, I feel depressed today, therefore the grass is to blame for my depression. Well, you make two statements that might be true. Yes, the grass is green. The grass usually is green. The grass is green, and you may very well feel depressed today. But you mention nothing about the color of the grass green in your conclusion of the green grass. You mention nothing of the grass's color, which in your last conclusion, and at the same time, you make no argument for why grass causes your depression. You just make two statements and then try to say that green grass causes depression. So it's illogical. It's not a good argument. Petitio principii is begging the question. It is assuming what you set out to prove ahead of time. It's kind of leading the witness, so to speak. So rather than making an argument and helping someone to see where you're coming from, you kind of set them up to just believe in your argument without having to make a good argument. So an example of this is saying the accused person will be given a fair trial before they're hanged. Well, if you're saying they're automatically going to be hanged, then it means you're already leaning. You're already slanting to one side. How can they be given a fair trial? Like, you contradict yourself. So you're already assuming they're going to be hanged. How on earth will, or I'm sorry, you're already assuming that they're guilty because you're saying that they're going to be hanged. So how on earth could you give them a fair trial if you're already assuming that they're guilty? So again, you've already assumed what you believe to be true. It's very similar to when in an argument you kind of already in your mind assume something to be true. You assume that what the other person is saying is it's wrong, and so you don't listen to their argument at all. That is an example of begging the question. Is you just automatically assume that it's wrong because so and so said it, or because you just believe to be wrong. You're not going to listen to what they have to say. It's a pretty wrong thing to do in terms of logic and seeking wisdom. Lastly, a contradictory premise. This simply means that the premises in your argument contradict each other, so at least one of the premises of your argument must be false, and as a result, your strategy for making the argument is a bad one. So an example is saying that there are absolutely no absolutes. Well, as you can clearly see, that's a contradiction. By saying that there are no absolutes, you are declaring an absolute. You are saying that it's absolutely true that there are no absolutes, and that's contradiction. We see this pretty clearly in the use of moral relativism, when we say nothing is true, everything is subjective, everything is just an opinion, there's no such thing as truth. Well, to say that everything is an opinion and there's no such thing as truth is to declare a truth. So it's contradictory. It's not good logic in your argument. So now let's put it to practice. Here are 3 examples of fallacies of argumentation. And take a second, pause your video, and write down which one is an example of a non sequitur, which one's an example of begging the question, and which one's an example of contradictory premise. All right, well, if you're done, then we can go ahead. If not, pause the video, take your time, but we're going to go through the answers right now. The first one, I will not tolerate intolerance. Obviously, that's a contradiction. To say you're not going to tolerate intolerance is an example of being intolerant, technically. So you're contradicting yourself. So that's a contradictory premise. I hate courthouses, therefore you will lose your case in court today. That is an example of a non sequitur. It does not follow. Just because you hate courthouses, what does that have to do with me lose? Why does that mean I'm going to lose my case today? That's a bad strategy in arguing that you're going to lose your case. You could have argued that I didn't prepare well, that I don't have a good basis to my case. The fact that you hate courthouses has nothing to do with it. So it does not follow. It's a non sequitur. You can't help believing in free will. You're predestined to think that way. An example of begging the question. You can obviously tell that this person is trying to argue in predestination, that we're already predetermined in the way we think and we act and what's going to happen to us, which is the opposite of free will. So by saying that you can't help believing in free will because you're predestined to think that way is leading the witness. It's begging the question. It's already assuming the final conclusion in your answer. And so you're trying to get someone to agree that predestination is true rather than arguing that it's true by trying to argue that because you only use free will, predestination must be true. You're predestined to think that way. That's begging the question. You're leading the witness. Fallacies of induction. So an example of this would be a false analogy. So it's when we use an analogy that lacks real resemblance, or using an analogy falsely by assuming that when 2 things are similar to one way, they will be similar in another way. So this is a fallacy through the misuse of evidence. So in trying to prove something to be true or not, we use an analogy incorrectly, or we use an analogy that's not a good analogy to try to prove our point. So, for instance, by saying you can't turn back the clock, it's referring to the point of you can't turn back time. You can't go back in time. But it's a bad analogy because you physically can turn back a clock. You can wind back a watch. You can turn the hand on the clock back on a physical clock. If it's a digital clock, you can move the numbers on it and change it. The fact that saying that you can't turn back the clock is a bad analogy. It's trying to use the analogy as physical proof, or as logical proof that we can't go back in time. Better example of not being able to go back in time is talking about how, physically with the laws of physics, even metaphysically, we can't move outside of time and space. Yes, you can actually change and move the arms on a clock or change the numbers on a digital clock. So that's a bad analogy to try to use. So it's a false analogy example. Argument from silence. So this is making the argument of bad evidence that just because a speaker or writer is silent about a topic, we can conclude that he does not believe in that topic or that there is no topic. This is used a lot of times in historical arguments, especially in theological arguments. People might try to argue, for instance, what Jesus believed about some modern day issues, or what he didn't believe about against it, because they say he didn't specifically say X. Well, that's not true. If we actually read about what different people wrote, or what Jesus implied, or the principles he set forward, we can make logical conclusions. So, for instance, saying that Jesus never said anything about nuclear bombs means that he would obviously be okay with nuclear bombs. Well, he didn't say anything about nuclear bombs because they didn't exist during, first century Judea. But that would be a bad argument to make. You would have to try to argue based on Jesus' premises about violence and nonviolence as a better use of evidence to try to argue what Christianity should or should not do about nuclear weapons. Simply saying that Jesus never said the phrase nuclear bombs and said nothing about it doesn't automatically mean he would be okay with it. It doesn't also automatically mean he would be against it. Silence doesn't mean consent. That's another way of saying argument from silence. Silence does not mean consent. Selective evidence. This is referring only to the evidence that supports your hypothesis. So a hypothesis in the scientific method, by its nature, means that you have to test a hypothesis and see the evidence that comes forth and make the conclusion based on that. You can't just pick the evidence that proves your point and then say, aha, my point is true. No, you also have to take into consideration the evidence that disproves your point, put them together, and then try to make the conclusion. So an example of selective evidence would be someone who's really pessimistic and trying to prove that life is getting worse only points to the bad things in life and ignores the good things. Well, in order to truly argue that life is getting worse, you have to show the evidence of both the bad things in life and the good things in life, and that the bad things are more than the good things. Simply ignoring the good things in life is ignoring evidence and being selective in the evidence that you choose. So once again, our practice. So here are 3 examples of fallacies of induction, of the improper use of evidence to make an argument. Classify them either as a false analogy, argument from silence, or selective evidence. So go ahead and pause your video now. Right, if you're not done, please pause your video again. But we're going to go through the answers. The first one, in trying to prove that fast food is good for you, you show all the underweight individuals who gain needed weight from eating fast food. This would be an example of selective evidence. So say someone needs to put on weight for health reasons. That is a thing. If someone, needs to, say, bulk up with good muscle for an athletic competition, or someone needs to go into a surgery procedure, needs to add weight. And so, yes, you could gain weight by eating fast food, but that doesn't mean that it's actually good for you. So you're using selective evidence of saying how fast food helped someone, even if it's skewed, to prove that fast food is good for you, while ignoring evidence that might say that fast food has negative effects on your health. You have to show both evidence and work with both to make a good argument. Loan companies are just like opportunistic vultures. They'll always strike at victims when they're at their weakest. This is an example of a false analogy of trying to compare loan companies to an opportunistic vulture, saying that just like vultures are always going after weak prey, so are loan companies. That's not necessarily always true. Sometimes loan companies, for instance, are doing the work of just doing regular work. You're paying on time and they're collecting it. They're not always banging on your door saying, pay up, Johnny. You're not Johnny, but you get my point. So it's a bad analogy. It's taking a literal analogy and using it as proof, or trying to make an analogy literal and using it as proof is a better way of saying it. The author never referred to their spouse. They must have never been married. This is an argument from silence. Just because an author in a book never talks about a spouse, we can't automatically assume they've never been married. We need better proof than that. One of the ways that we can make sure we don't fall into fallacies of induction, especially on selective evidence, is to make sure that we first uh, articulate the argument of the other person and their evidence for it, and then systematically go to show why the evidence is incorrect. This was a method that Thomas Aquinas used in the Summa Theologica. As you saw, he would first say his opponent's arguments, argue why they were wrong, and then as a result say why he was right. Acknowledging the other evidence is a good way to avoid a fallacy of induction. Last, we come to procedural fallacies. So you're not going to be quizzed on identifying different kinds of these fallacies, but just knowing that these are some mistakes that we can fall into when we're writing and when we're arguing that I think are pretty common. There's more in Kreeft's book, but I just want to point out these three. The first is ignoring an argument. So rather than answering someone's argument and arguing against their point, you just completely start talking about something unrelated and arguing about a point that has nothing to do, to just ignore that person's argument and just avoid answering their question altogether. The second one's pretty similar, but it's more manipulative. So answering another argument than one given. This is basically when you take the question or the argument that someone is making and you change the question so that way you can argue the argument you want to argue. So you argue with something that was never really said because you didn't listen to what they're actually trying to argue about. And lastly, winning the argument but losing the arguer. And this unfortunately happens way too often, especially on social media, is our desire to win an argument makes us use pretty bad tactics in logic, and we might lose a friendship, hurt someone in the process, and that's not a good use of logic either. Logic and debating, reaching conclusions are meant to help us draw closer to the truth, and there's a personal factor in there that we have to be mindful of. Vice versa, winning the arguer but losing the argument, we try to just befriend someone and are willing to say something against the truth or say something that's wrong just to win someone over, to get them on our side. That's also contrary to the truth, contrary to wisdom, because we also have to uphold truth. So it's a balance. Yes, we need to argue for the truth and do so logically and avoid fallacies, but not at the cost of using people or losing people. So these are examples of fallacies. So you can certainly now turn to the reading from Peter Kreeft on the second part, and in particular, the fallacies of argumentation begin on page 92. And you can work through some of these fallacies again. There's more fallacies here than we covered, but you can go through them for additional examples and additional practice before going into your quiz. And again, if you're confused before taking your quiz, or you're not sure, feel free to reach out and contact, refer back to the book while taking your quiz. And we'll be glad to help you if you need help.